All right. Hello, my loves. We are ready for one more chapter of Sideways Stories from Wayside School. The chapter today is the chapter number 14 called Sammy. Here is the picture. Here's the post-it note that was in this book that I don't know why it was in this book. But I do want you to know, before we read this chapter, that this chapter of this book is the chapter of this book that I think about when I think about this book. Take it or leave it, but that's just where we're at. All right. It was a horrible, stinky, rainy day. Some rainy days are fun and exciting, but not this one. This one stunk. All the children were wet and wore smelly raincoats, and the whole room smelled awful. Oh, it stinks in here, said Mauricia. Everybody laughed. But she was right. There was one good thing, however. There was a new boy in class. New kids are always fun, except no one could even tell what this new boy looked like. He was completely covered by his raincoat. Class, said Mrs. Jules, I'd like you all to meet Sammy. Let us show him what a nice class we can be. Leslie walked up and smiled at Sammy, but her smile quickly turned into a frown. You smell terrible, she said. Leslie, exclaimed Mrs. Jules, that's no way to greet a new member of our class. Mrs. Jules wrote Leslie's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. But he does, Mrs. Jules, said Leslie. He smells awful. You're ugly, Sammy replied. Now, Sammy, that's no way to talk, said Mrs. Jules. Leslie's a very pretty girl. She's ugly, said Sammy. Allison spoke up. Well, you smell terrible and are probably even uglier, but nobody can see you because you're hiding under that smelly old raincoat. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jules. Now, Sammy, why don't you take off your coat and hang it in the closet and let us see how nice you look? I don't want to, you old windbag, said Sammy. That's because he's so ugly, said Leslie. I'm sure he's quite handsome, said Mrs. Jules. He's just shy. Here, let me help you. And Mrs. Jules took off Sammy's raincoat for him. I'm yawning all the time. I don't know why. But underneath it was another raincoat, even dirtier and smellier than the first one, and they still couldn't see his face. Oh, now he smells even worse, said Mauricia. You don't exactly smell like a rose either, Sammy replied. Mrs. Jules took off his second raincoat, and there was another one under that, and the smell became so bad that Mrs. Jules had to run and stick her head out of the window for some fresh air. You're all a bunch of pigs, Sammy screeched. Dirty, rotten pigs. The smell was overpowering. Sammy just stood there, hidden under all his raincoats. Mrs. Jules wrote Sammy's name on under the word discipline. Send him home in the kindergarten bus, said Joy. Not with me, said Todd. Mrs. Jules held her nose. She walked up to Sammy and removed his raincoat, and she threw it out the window. But he had on still another one. Sammy hissed, Hey, old windbag, watch where you throw my good clothes. Mrs. Jules put a check next to Sammy's name on the blackboard, and she took off another raincoat and threw it out the window, and the smell got worse, for he had on still another one. And Sammy began to laugh. His horrible laugh was even worse than his horrible voice. When Sammy first came in the room, he was 4 feet tall. But after Mrs. Jules removed 6 of his raincoats, he was only 3 feet tall, and there were still more raincoats to go. Mrs. Jules circled his name and removed another coat, and she threw it out the window. She then put a triangle around the circle and threw out another one of his coats outside. And she kept doing this until Sammy was only 1.5 feet high, and the smell got worse. Some of the children held their ears, others... Oh. Sorry, I totally missed a whole bunch. Mrs. Jules circled his name and removed another coat. She threw it out the window. Then she put a triangle around the circle and threw another one of his coats out the window. She kept doing this until Sammy was only 1.5 feet high. With every coat she took off, Sammy's laugh got louder and the smell got worse. Some of the children held their ears. Others could hold only one ear because they were holding their nose with the other hand. And it was hard to say which was worse, the laugh or the smell. Sammy stopped laughing and said, Hey, old windbag, if you take off one more of my coats and throw it out the window, I'll bite your head off. They smell too bad for me to allow them in my classroom, said Mrs. Jules. You can pick them up when you leave. They smell better than you do, pighead, Sammy shouted. Mrs. Jules didn't stop. She took off another one of his coats and then another and another. Sammy was only 4 inches tall, 3 inches tall, 2 inches tall, and at last she removed the final coat. All that was there was a dead rat. "Well, I don't allow dead rats in my classroom," said Mrs. Jewls, and she picked it up by the tail and put it in a plastic bag and threw it away. Mrs. Jewls did not allow dead rats in her class. Todd once brought in a dead rat for show and tell, and Mrs. Jewls made him throw that one away too. "I'm glad Sammy isn't allowed in our classroom," said Rondi. "I didn't like him very much." "Yes," said Mrs. Jewls, "we caught another one." Dead rats were always trying to sneak into Mrs. Jewls' class. That was the third one she'd caught since September. Remember how I said that Rondi's chapter might be the weirdest? I think Sammy's chapter is the weirdest. But it is a chapter that every time I think about this book, that is the chapter that I think about. Because it was not a kid. It was just a dead rat calling her a windbag. So there's that. I love you very much.